Hey everyone, Alex from Cytonox here, and today I'll be ranking the bosses in God of War 4 from worst to best. When it came out in 2018, God of War 4 was praised by many as a bold new direction for the acclaimed hack and slash series. While I found it to be far less gory and brutal than other games in the franchise, I still thought it was a pretty good game. I will note as an aside here that the gameplay I used is all me playing on the easiest difficulty. I absolutely hate doing this, and this is literally the only game I've ever played or will ever play this way, but I find normal enemies to be unbearably tanky even on normal mode, and for the sake of my own enjoyment I set it here. As proof that I'm still decently good at the game, I no damaged a handful of the fights and only ever got one health upgrade for the entire game. Also, I'll be counting all the Valkyries as one entry since they're extremely similar, and I could not be bothered to grind out accessing every one of those fights again. I have beaten all of them before though, so I can still speak from past experience. Of the handful of foes Kratos and Atreus encounter on their trek through the Norse wilds, there are some definite ups and downs when it comes to boss quality. Let's get into them. Oops, I think I broke her. These guys are just generic side quest mini-bosses. You're required to fight a handful of them, with the first encounter being at Alfheim fairly early in the game. The encounter is literally never deviated from in any meaningful way by its comrades, save for the color of its insides depending on the name. The fire, lava, frost, ice, stone, forest, whatever ancients are all a matter of chucking your axe over and over whenever he opens up to blast stuff at you. I couldn't even be bothered to dodge, I just tanked it and beat him down for the sake of getting it over with quickly. You might think the Soul Eater and Soul Devourer are more threatening based on their crazy sounding names, but the only things these buffoons are good at eating is punishment. I killed them both disrespectfully fast. Overall, just generic mini-boss fare with no merit other than dropping rare armor components. The Trolls are basically the same as the Ancients, but more of the fights are mandatory for game progression, and are more fun even if they're similarly easy and short. You at least have to dodge, which is something. They're typical lumbering brute enemies, armed with a big rectangle thing to bash your head in. Stay behind them and they're pretty much toast. More engaging than the Ancients, but still not really memorable. Two trolls at once is cooler than one, right? Still a pushover, but there's at least an earnest effort to make a solid fight here. They make their health bars somewhat conjoined, which removes the usual gank strategy of nuking one off the bat, so that's sort of interesting. I'm well aware of the fact that bashing bosses for being too easy while playing on the easy difficulty sounds incredibly stupid, but take my word for it that in normal mode they're nothing to sneeze at either. The Dark Elf's name is hilarious. I'm not sure how to pronounce it at all, but I've always said Svartaljofer as it's spelled, which I assume is correct. The main reason I put the fight here is the lighting makes it look really cool, and he has a fair amount of health so it doesn't end as fast as the fights before it. Attack-wise, he's basically the same as the other Dark Elf enemies with projectile flash orbs and some other basics, but nothing that interesting. I absolutely bitched him here, and it's not even something to brag about. Spartan Rage Mode lets you knock him around like a toy, and it's admittedly really fun, if a bit sad. The finisher is kinda satisfying too. It reminds me of some glory kills from Doom where you take someone's staff and use it on them. I think this fight is just okay, which is where a lot of the bosses fall for me, I've noticed. Alright, this placement could confuse people a little. I will say that it has the best finisher in the game, and is the fight that reminds me the most of the older God of War games. It's definitely not a bad fight, but it suffers from being overly simple and having no story significance. The hype behind major God of War boss fights historically has been that you're beating the snot out of some legendary creature or a god or some other storied figure. And with it, once you've killed said boss, carries this sense of there being no going back, and the ramifications on the world are pretty huge. Killing this random dragon, Hraezlar, is cool, but I don't really care that much, and it leaves it with far less staying power than most large-scale bosses in the series. And considering the gameplay is just chucking sap at it while it charges lightning moves, it's not likely to give you a run for your money. It does get pretty cool looking near the end when he's sending out lasers and stuff, but it's all smoke and mirrors since actually getting hit by it is really rare in my experience. This fight lives or dies on its visual appeal, and while I definitely enjoy the part where you hack up his tongue and crane him in the neck and all that crazy carnage, it was more of a movie than even past games were. I rather like QuickTime events myself, and I found the ones in this game really disappointing. They were all just button mashing and pale in comparison to the way games like Metal Gear Rising did it, for example, or even past titles where at least they used buttons other than square. Herazler is fun but very overrated in my opinion, so he fits best in the middle part of my ranking. This guy is technically one of the trolls, and while I gave them a less than glowing review, I think Maturgur Helsen stands out pretty dramatically. For one, he has enough health to stand on his own pretty solidly. Two, he has a vastly larger move pool than the other trolls, or at least a very different, much harder one. He can teleport, which is slightly annoying if he keeps doing it, but it enables him to get the jump on you with some surprise attacks, which adds a unique kind of threat to the mix. I also think that his damage is pretty impressive, or at least it felt that way with my measly 1 health upgrade. He can summon enemies, which is annoying in a lot of other games, but these guys are pure fodder and are actually kind of fun to mess up with the classic chains. Pulling out his heart is also pretty gnarly, at least in comparison to the finishers for most bosses in this game. Maturgur Helsen stands out as far superior to his troll brethren and decently fun despite the relatively low scale. Alright, I know bashing on Herazler for using Spectacle as a crutch and then putting this so high is a bit hypocritical. This is just a cutscene where you get to R1 spam Baldur a few times. However easy Herazler was, it was at least better than that. That said, this fight sure looks pretty awesome. I love how you're just flying all over the world and tumbling into stuff and things are breaking and you eventually wind up in Helheim and it's just nuts. The actual fight portion is the least interesting since it's the most static and it gets sort of repetitive just bashing Baldur's skull in. I can't place this fight any higher because gameplay-wise it's super straightforward, but it looks so cool that I just have more fun with it than everything below here. God of War has a history of great first bosses, and this latest entry did not disappoint. This first encounter has Kratos shaking off the rust against a god for the first time in a long while, and given he's an invincible opponent, Kratos holds up quite well. The mystery of the stranger's identity is something sure to capture your interest on a first playthrough, and pairing it with a fight that is equal parts cinematic and fast-paced is a recipe for success. This is the least balanced fight for the way I handled the game, so I'll concede that the beating I gave him here is not at all representative of how the fight normally goes. While he's extremely light on health on easy mode to the point of being practically stun-lockable with heavy attacks as shown here, he is usually able to take more damage and get more licks in between phase changes. I love that bit where you battering ram him in the gut with a tree trunk, drive him through solid rock, and then get a solid period of Spartan Rage mode to fist him to death. Spartan Rage mode is a blast, so I'm glad the game is generous with its utility here. On the occasion that Baldur does attack you, it's usually some parryable melee attacks or an unblockable ice pound, so he can at least switch you up a little bit. Overall, this introductory fight with Baldur is packed with all the cinematic brutality the series is known for and some fun gameplay, so it makes for a great first impression on new players. Talking in terms of gameplay alone, the Valkyries are probably the top contender, and are only third due to lesser story significance and scale. They're definitely the coolest looking bosses in the game to me, which helps also. I've talked a lot of trash about how easy the bosses in this game are, but even on easy mode the Valkyries were able to give me a beating that tempered my arrogance quite a bit. They're all slightly different but share the core moves of wing swings and feather shooting among others. Learning to dodge this one aerial move was driving me insane until I realized you had to cancel her out of it with an axe throw, which I really liked. Forcing you to get creative like this is all part of a skill that's very valuable in action games, being the willingness to frustrate the player in such a way that you know they can break through and be rewarded when they do. While my fight with Garudaful is a bit messy due to being my first fight with one since my initial playthrough in 2018, I can proudly say that I at least no-damaged Eir here, which made me feel pretty good. These fights all have a similar structure, where you try to nuke them off the bat with runic attacks in rage mode, and if they're not super low on health after that, you've just got to wait till your moves come back and let them loose again. I do regret to inform you guys that I did not record a fight with Sigrun, but I assure you that that is only because I would rather perform a root canal on myself with no anesthesia than ever suffer through the stupidly boring slog that is Muspelheim and Niflheim ever again. But I can still vividly recall receiving the ass beating of a century from her even on easy mode, which is still probably one of the most humiliating things that's ever happened to me in a video game. The optional super boss is a time-honored video game trope I've always enjoyed, and the fact that God of War was kind enough to put a whole side quest worth of them in these games is awesome, even if 3 of them are locked behind mind-numbingly dull and grindy feeling prerequisites. And yeah, I'm sorry for mentioning it over and over again, but if you couldn't tell, I'm still really salty about how much the optional areas in this game gargle penis. I was absolutely itching to beat up these two Claudes for much of the game, so getting to do so was a real treat. Firstly, this is the only fight with a god in the game other than the Baldur ones, so you get that feeling that this fight is going to be pretty major. Secondly, they've been cracking jokes about Long Dong and Kratos' dead wife ever since their first appearance, so they were shoveling some major disrespect the way of Kratos and Atreus. Lastly, the fight is just a really good time. It's got the classic slow guy, fast guy thing going on, which is nothing new, but having Atreus split the aggro is actually a fun twist since a 2 versus 2 fight is something not seen in games all that often. Magni is packing Ludwig's Holy Blade with bolt paper, and Modi's got a Tonitrus, to use a Bloodborne analogy, and that description sums it up pretty well. There are some sequences where they run at you while shrouded in some storm clouds and you've got to deflect them with your shield over your shoulder, which I actually found pretty fun since it's sort of an intermission between phases and they get progressively harder to stay fresh each time, adding fake outs and such. I like how many moves they have combined, like Magni having a grab Atreus can break with arrows and a variety of swings and electric moves befitting of Thor's children. Yeah, that's the other hype part of the fight. You know that Thor's going to be pissed at you for putting an axe in his kid's face, and that means an awesome Thor boss fight sometime in the future Ragnarok game. All in all, Magni and Modi are just really enjoyable and definitely one of the more important boss fights in the game, so I'd mark them down as pretty awesome. Every single person I know who's played this game says this is the best boss, so I apologize for not breaking the mold with a more interesting pick, but this is really just the coolest. It's the culmination of a whole game's worth of conflict with Baldur, from the very first fight at Kratos' house all the way to this massive scale showdown for all the marbles. Freya decides to become a neurotic nuisance and protect her son even though he wants her head on a pike, and revives the massive corpse of Thamur as her puppet, which you previously traversed around the midpoint of the game. There are so many crazy set pieces in this fight that it beats everything else by a wide margin, and starts off pretty dramatically too. The actual fighting is pretty easy if you use that insanely overpowered laser rune attack, which ends his first phase in a matter of seconds, but that's not really the main attraction here. He does also get some cool new tricks in later phases, like swapping colors to force you to switch weapons and flinging some ice attacks your way. This keeps you on your toes, and even if it's not too brutal, it still feels intense. I did get a pretty hardcore beatdown from Baldur at one point, so he's definitely not a joke. And of course, finally snapping Baldur's neck and killing him is incredibly satisfying after he's endured so much effortlessly throughout the game. It's very final, and knowing his death will usher in Ragnarok adds a sense of foreboding and excitement for the sequel excellently. I've spent the whole video appraising bosses based on a balance of cinematic and gameplay elements, but this final battle is the perfect fusion of these two things and serves as an amazing send-off to what would end up becoming the game of the year in 2018. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. This has been one of the most requested video topics for a while now, so I'm glad to have finally gotten to it. Next week I'll be covering an underrated gem that's one of my personal favorite games, No More Heroes. If you haven't heard of it, I really encourage you to give it a try, and hopefully enjoy my video along with it. That's all for now. Deuces.